Hi, welcome to Beyond the Filter. I'm your host, Liz Ryerson, and I'm here with Briahna Joy Gray, a writer and lawyer from New York City. Do you want to introduce yourself more?
Only to say that I'm also the co-host of SWOTI podcast, that's Someone's Wrong on the Internet podcast, and a contributing editor at Current Affairs magazine.
Yeah, and that's how I became aware of your work. By the way, the website for your SWOTI podcast is remarkably professionally designed. I like it.
Oh, I'll be sure to pass on that compliment to my co-host Joe, who is the one who designed it.
Is he a photographer? There's so many photos of you guys.
No, we had a really narcissistic photo shoot in which Joe's boyfriend trailed us around Manhattan one day and very patiently stuck with us while we posed all over the village.
Nice. Well, I like it. Yeah, I've listened to several of your episodes, and I really like it. I think specifically, no problem. Specifically, what I like about it is you're very willing to take on, and maybe this is because you're a lawyer, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but you're willing to take on some of these issues, these hot button like issues of the discourse, particularly on the left, and sort of look at them from an angle of specifically like tactics and strategies, and not just warring for like the correct position in terms of like the highest moral ground.
Yeah, I think that's because on the left, there's not really any disagreement about what's right and wrong, right? The fissures between the center left and the far left have nothing to do with whether or not we value the lives of immigrants, for instance, or feel like people of color should have equality of opportunity, or any of these things that we end up having debates with people on the right. So I think a lot of times these conversations devolve into, well, I care more about people of color than you care about people of color. And that just doesn't interest me, because it seems fairly obvious that everyone on some level, intellectually, ideologically at least, cares about the same thing. And the question then becomes, what strategies are best suited to actually materially benefit various communities? What political or rhetorical strategies are best able to advance certain goals? And what subjects are there that there actually is genuine, uncertainty about? Topics like we talk about, like Asian American racism, which seems to be the last bastion of racism, even among so-called good liberals. We talk about an episode which we actually haven't aired yet. We talk about, Rachel Dolezal, and how no one really gives a satisfactory answer for why, being transracial and transgender are different things. And I think it's important to be able to draw that line if you want to protect the rights and interests of the trans community. So we like to go there, not because we're kind of courting disagreement, but because we think that these are the conversations that most need to be had, particularly in a Trumpian world where we need to be putting our best foot forward.
Yeah, well, we need to have a more coherent vision of reality, and we need to like do it in a way that we don't sort of fall into the stereotypes of it's just people being upset about personal beefs or personal behavior. Like, you feel upset about a particular expression of something, and like, in a piece of media or something that somebody said on Twitter, and then, a bunch of people have arguments about that, and nothing is really resolved, but maybe it helps drive people's particular brand of commentary or whatever, but it's not really, doesn't really lend itself to actual, like, moving forward on some of these issues and creating more of a consensus. And the only way that you can do that is to ask difficult and sometimes pretty upsetting questions. But the alternative is to have like no vision of reality that is coherent, that can really address some of these more thorny issues. So
I think that's right.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's really good that you're doing that. Do you feel like you've had a lot of like pushback against that?
What's funny is people often, anticipate that I would have. And, you know, I was recording a show last weekend, and, you know, I was, you know, the host said I was brave for bringing up things and yada, yada, yada. And I actually feel like I don't receive that much negative pushback. And at first I thought, because I was largely writing about race and identity, that I was able to avoid a lot of the backlash that other writers have gotten, just because I'm Black and a woman. But I also, now that I've written about some other subjects and, you know, haven't gotten as much backlash about those as well, I think it also has something to do with the fact that I do try a lot in the things that I write to acknowledge the alternative points of view, and why I think that they're often founded in something reasonable, right? So to the extent that I write about identity politics, I want to caveat and make sure I address the fact that there is a good reason why people of color are distrustful of narratives that specifically say they're going to reach out to the interests of white Americans. Because historically, those kinds of narratives have been disproportionately racist and throwing people of color in the bus. So I think that whereas other writers might just say, you know, identity politics is problematic for X, Y, and Z reason, even if I agree that that's true, I will also acknowledge that people who are distrustful of that critique aren't doing so in a vacuum, aren't wary in a vacuum. And I think that kind of gets people to like lower their heckles a little bit and feel a little less defensive and attacked, because I credit their feelings of resistance, or at least I try to.
Yeah, and I think online it's really easy to miss the context in a lot of these situations. Like, I don't know, there's a lot of reaction. I think a lot of people get sort of grouped together. Like, if you have a reaction, you and somebody isn't educated on the more fair side, or is just straight up like bigoted against your particular who you are or your perspective, or they just don't understand it. There's a sort of a, like, when the context is missing, when all that stuff is missing, it's easy to just pick like some ridiculous personality on Twitter who you disagree with and use that as an example of the other side's beliefs or whatever, or whatever side that you don't agree with. Like, specifically, let's say people on the left versus the more sort of centrism. It's easy to take somebody who's like a big media personality and argue that is, you know, that position kind of comes from just this person building their brand or whatever, and like miss some of the context about, you know, why this stuff is the way that it is, and you know, why people are reacting and responding to that in that way. And like, I feel like it's really hard to have that conversation online, though, because I feel like it's very reactionary, and it's very kind of built against having those kinds of like serious discussions. And the people who are the most reactionary, or at least the people who are the most like don't engage with nuance and stuff, and just kind of drive their commentary via anger about whatever, tend to have bigger platforms, or at least get out there quicker than people who are trying to make more nuanced or kind of complex arguments.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, you know, complexity doesn't sell as well. It's not as easy to pick up and understand. But I guess maybe I'm naive because I'm fairly new to this game. But I do have a lot of confidence in the ability to make a nuanced argument that translates. If only because I'm a person who, you know, this time last year just got on Twitter and, you know, had a couple hundred Twitter followers. And, you know, I don't have a journalist background. I'm just a lawyer who started writing kind of last summer because I felt like certain narratives weren't getting enough play. And was really heartened by the response to the things that I had written and the kinds of stuff that I tweeted, and kind of, I like to think that even if limited to Twitter and the 140 characters we used to have, I was making, you know, arguments of some nuance, and they were getting enough traction that kind of my follower count, you know, exploded, and people really responded to the articles. And so I think that there definitely is space for more complexity than most people engage in. Although I also do think that it requires, a person to really know what they're saying, to kind of have done the intellectual work to distill their viewpoint and really think through all of the counter arguments before they put themselves out there. Because Twitter is not kind to those who would misstep or simply change their mind.
Yeah, well, and your writing is in comparison to a lot of other writers, very cut and dry about a lot of these issues. Like, you lay them out very clearly. It's not like the language isn't particularly flowery or whatever. Like, there isn't kind of as much ambiguity, which ambiguity can be a good thing sometimes. But as far as like dealing with these very thorny issues, it's good because it lays out the argument in a very like straightforward manner that's like easy to understand for things that are often very complex, and like the structures of the internet are not necessarily of like media on the internet are not necessarily equipped very well to deal with the complexities of, although maybe people become more and more disillusioned with the more sort of one-dimensional reactionary media and start to get become thirstier for something that's more substantial and like is actually trying to come to a clearer or more coherent understanding of a particular issue. I mean, I'm certainly one of those people. I want to know like the core of a thing. Like, I really want to know, just because I think it's important to know that, and I don't think it's important to like know what somebody's opinion is on like most movies or things that have come out. Like, I mean, I'm interested to know that, but I'm like, as somebody who also writes about media, like, I don't think that people's takes on media are particularly great or helpful a lot of the time. At least like popular takes, because I think that like media itself is very complex and very hard to sort of pin down and requires a lot of nuance to be able to talk about. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, I definitely find there's some commentators that provide value. I'm sometimes I like it, sometimes I don't. The podcast Still Processing, the New York Times podcast with Jenna Wortham and Wesley Morris, culture editors of the New York Times. Sometimes, it does seem like, okay, they like Moonlight. Great, everyone liked Moonlight. But sometimes because of their, especially Wesley Morris having kind of a deep knowledge of cultural history, can bring insights to the subject and give me backgrounds on, this is a theater adaptation that originally aired in 1962, that enabled me to see things differently. And I do think that there are types of conversations which I do find meaningful. I was just participated in a special episode of Struggle Session, which hasn't aired yet, with T from Champagne Sharks, in which the three of us talked about Black Panther, and specifically whether or not it is kind of has an anti-Black liberation message, which the two of them believed was represented by the fact that Killmonger, the vessel of the anti-Black liberation, of the Black liberation message, was the villain, and lost at the end of the movie. And so I think that kind of discussion that that kind of gets to the heart of like whether there's subversive messaging or kind of whether or not a movie is misleading in terms of advancing kind of revolutionary goals, and whether or not there's kind of neoliberal subtext in the media that we consume, and whether that's particularly dangerous if disguised as something that is in fact revolutionary. Those kind of conversations I think have some merit, although I think that you're right that more purely aesthetic observations often aren't particularly useful, or
at least they don't like. I don't know. I've noticed this from especially people who are writers who write about a specific kind of media. There are certain sort of trends and ways that like you write about like I write a lot about video games, and I think one of the things that that I've found to be a challenge is how do you write about a medium that while I think is growing a lot artistically, has a lot of problems, and like a lot of the media is very reactionary and kind of very difficult to analyze in a way that is kind of interesting, or actually kind of talks about it in a cultural context. And part of the reason I do that is because I know that I understand that stuff well enough to try and take that on, but there is not that much stuff out there. There's like tons of tons of articles and YouTube videos and all that, like analyzing video games out there, but not much of it is very interesting or appealing to me. So I think I take that as a challenge. But because of that, like, I think it's important, like, knowing that I'm dealing with like a medium that is very difficult to talk about. I think it's like really important to talk about the cultural context and the background and stuff. And I feel like I often don't see that, like, in discussions of movies and music and all that kind of stuff. Specifically, like elements of, like when we're talking about like pop music, for example. I mean, I like a lot of pop music, but there is that like kind of disinterest in talking about how pop music is actually made. Who actually writes the pop music, like the sort of industrial processes behind making it, who has the sort of agency in presenting and marketing it, and who is deciding, like, you know, what music or what movies or what media we see in general and what we don't. And oftentimes the things that are the most interesting or have the most to say culturally are not things that are, you know, we're going to be exposed to or most people are going to know about. So is it the goal of like somebody who's writing about a piece of media to bring that to the sort of popular attention? Or is it the goal to sort of reflect on something that is already culturally ubiquitous? And it feels like increasingly it's more the latter, and like media that's made on a smaller scale that's not backed by lots of corporate dollars and all that kind of stuff doesn't get talked about. And I think that's the frustrating thing to me, just about, you know, discussions of media and art in general.
That's interesting. I guess I'm one who feels like I have an interest in pop culture because it is popular, and I think there's obviously utility. I mean, everything that, it's not a meritocracy, right? Everything that's popular isn't popular because it's the best, and so I appreciate the extent to which there should be more interest in, more esoteric artistic products, cultural products, what have you. But, you know, I think that there's something to be said for why something becomes popular and kind of the shared community of popular art products that kind of start to define who we are as a culture. And I'm someone who watches popular television shows because I know they're popular and other people watch them, and I want to be able to participate in the conversation. You know, I just binge watched season 1 of This Is Us, you know, less because I want to watch This Is Us. I mean, partly, you know, people I like say it's good, so I respect their opinion, but also because I'm tired of every Thursday night or whatever it is, seeing Twitter go crazy and kind of being left out of the conversation. And I see interesting articles, you know, discussing, you know, the racial politics of the show and, you know, other kind of like, show adjacent sociological factors or social factors, and I want to be able to participate. You know, I watched Breaking Bad not because I'm particularly interested in that genre of show, but because I wanted to be able to speak with some authority on people who are debating whether or not, you know, it was kind of drug tourism and a kind of fetishization of an enterprise that could only happen with a white protagonist. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
those are conversations I find to be valuable and interesting and kind of speak to where we are culturally in a moment. And I have a super duper FOMO about being left out of those things.
Well, I think that's part of the problem, though. Like, I mean, I think that commentary in itself is great and valid, but it feels like that's everything. Like, it feels like the entirety of the conversation in a lot of different kinds of media is around these sort of massive events. Like, and a lot of culture has collapsed. Like, a lot of culture on the fringes in particular has collapsed. And because of that, everything is sort of collapsed into this sort of like fan culture, where, you know, we're all sort of fans and we're all sort of and it feels like a lot of articles examining this media border on fan fiction in a way that's like maybe slightly more presentable or whatever. I mean, I think these like conversations about representation and power dynamics and all that kind of stuff as it applies to mainstream media is really interesting. Like, I mean, I'm interested to have those conversations, but I also think like it's very easy for them to erase like that, to erase everything else, especially when there's this kind of like a desire for this monoculture. And I don't know, like as an artist who like I'm never going to like work on something mainstream successful. But it would be nice to like, you know that something that either I or people that I know or artists that are working on the fringes who are really trying to do interesting stuff are being recognized and supported for that. And like the way that the media landscape exists doesn't really account for that. It doesn't really like let those people exist very easily. And I feel like there's just not much of a sort of incentive or push for people to engage with that media. And I guess I have problems with that specifically because when we see something come out of like as a piece of pop culture sort of come out, we know that we have to be aware that it's presented to us through, you know, all this like private money and corporate marketing and all that kind of stuff. And so the message they're going to get is something that they're comfortable with presenting to a mass audience. So the idea of it being more kind of like something that has really something new or interesting or complex to say, it's difficult. And I mean, there has been media, like I haven't seen Black Panther. I did see Get Out, and I like that movie quite a bit. And it seems like I would probably like Black Panther, although I don't like superhero movies generally. And from what I've seen, the discussions that I've seen around it are interesting. I obviously don't really have a particular position on it because I haven't seen it, but and like I'm glad that those conversations are happening, but it just feels like, what about all this other media that you know, it doesn't have all these like corporate dollars sort of being thrown into it, doesn't have all this marketing being thrown into it, you know, and work from marginalized people in particular that maybe only exists in those particular communities and never is going to sort of get out of that because of, you know, one particular feature of the artist who's making it, or they just don't have resources or whatever. Like what happens to that stuff? And I just feel frustrated that there's not like much of a cultural space for that stuff to be recognized. And I know that like, I know people who will say like, I want to write about that stuff, but no one reads it. So they don't.
I guess it's a little hard for me to conceptualize what it is you have in mind specifically, because there's the reality that there's a huge bolus of content that's never going to be seen and should never be seen because it's just not very good. Right? There's this other subset of artistic product that is pretty good, a much smaller sliver that's very good and is never going to be seen just because it doesn't have the requisite backing to make it publicly widely available. There's, in pop culture, a huge quantity of it that is made and has a lot of backing and a lot of money and dollars that go into it, which also ends up being pretty good. That money actually bears out results. There's another huge portion of which all that money and backing just lifts up a fairly mediocre product on par with some of the stuff in the first bolus that just never is seen or heard of, right? So I guess the question is, you know, I guess what I'm saying is that there does seem to me to be a lot of product that is unknown, that's unknown because it shouldn't be known. And the real question isn't should we be paying more attention to unknown stuff? It's how do we access that sliver of stuff that actually is worthy and worthwhile, but just doesn't ever get the backing because, you know, life isn't a meritocracy.
Well, how do we actually like know what's worthy and how do we like, you know, deem something worthy? Because like the thing is like, I mean, fucking Batman versus Superman got tons of people talking about it. That movie, like that kind of stuff sucks, but like
really, really bad.
Yeah, and like, so why is that worthy of lots of discussion, but something that is crappy that no one knows about is not worth? Like, those things are, if you're examining it from the angle of it's indicative of culture, it's indicative of a certain kind of cultural thing, then you're not necessarily even analyzing whether it's good or bad. Then why should we exclude that stuff?
Well, to me, the difference between Batman and Superman, and my interest in that, even though it's bad, and my interest in something unknown, even though it's bad, is that I can have a conversation about Batman and Superman and why it's bad, and still communicate and draw connections with other people. I was at work just 2 weeks ago at like a welcome lunch for a new associate, and we ended up talking about Batman and Superman and exactly how bad it was, and it turned into an interesting conversation about what we look for in a movie, how good narrative arcs are drawn, what movies compare favorably to it, the other work by that director, and what his pitfalls typically are. And so I think that like art doesn't have to be like, I guess I'm resistant to this notion. I think that there's something kind of intrinsically valuable in popular products because of the way they enable us to talk to each other. Even if it's not necessarily fair, I think the popularity in and of itself is somehow worthwhile. And the same way that, you know, Duchamp putting a urinal in the middle of an empty museum space is worthwhile because of the conversation it provokes, not because of any intrinsic artistic merit inherent to a urinal.
Well, I think it's worthwhile, but I question whether, like, why can't we have a conversation about how our preferences and the media we consume and the conversations we have are designed and mediated through these sort of corporate, the advertising in these corporate networks. Like, if there is an effort to examine how this stuff has an effect on our daily lives and like the way that we view information and stuff, why can't we also examine the way that it affects our ability to enjoy stuff like entertainment and art? And that's not saying that you have to throw mass media out. Like, I mean, I watch a lot of garbage media in general, but like, that is saying that, like, I feel like that conversation needs to be have beyond just saying like, you know, we need it or it's important because it's culturally ubiquitous and it's a conversation starter. Like, I feel like we need to go beyond that.
So what does that look like to you? Because I'm not seeing, I mean, the reason things are the way they are is because of the systems are the way they are, right? So we have things like YouTube that are somewhat democratized, and you get people like Issa Rae who get to have shows because she was a self-starter and enough people watched it, and then HBO picks it up. Like, we live in a world where I actually don't think we have a growing monoculture. I think that the internet, among other things, has made it much more likely that people have their kind of prestige or discrete or idiosyncratic watching habits. So we might all have watched The Sopranos or Breaking Bad, but these days, you know, there are those of us who watch Atlanta, and then there's another subset of us who are watching, you know, some other kind of prestige show, and none of these things are getting the kind of mass cultural appeal that shows like Friends and Sopranos used to have. We have, and you know, and more people, more kind of diverse vantage perspectives are getting more opportunities. And yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Well, okay. I guess I mean, I agree with that. Like, although I think like, I mean, like, I think more people I know about Atlanta than some of these other kinds of, well, I'm thinking specifically in terms of like independent media, independent music and stuff that I followed in the mid 2000s, which was like, it was on a smaller scale, and there was a sort of a different network for getting out there and distributing independent music. And it's a different audience, people who are interested in that. But what has happened is that because everyone's has to be on the same platform now, you know, we're all on the same platform as, you know, we're all on Twitter, we're all on YouTube, we're all on whatever, like, then we're kind of put up against, you know, whoever else is on that same platform, and it flattens things. And while there are like a lot of options within that, a lot of these networks that were more built towards spreading independent media have kind of gone away. And I guess the flip side is that like there have been important cultural conversations that have come into consciousness because of everyone being on the same platform, like people realizing that, you know, a particular marginalized group has, you know, is able to fully express like a lot of things that, you know, affect them day to day in society, and like have those conversations sort of erupt into the mainstream. Like that's been a really good thing. But like I wonder, I don't know, from the position of someone who's an artist, like what do you do when you're kind of expected? It feels like there's this expectation like you have to sort of appeal to this mass culture or you're not part of the conversation and you don't matter.
Well, I'm not, I guess, an artist in that way, so I can't speak to that feeling or speak for artists who may feel that way. But I don't know that I agree with that premise, at least insofar as that we live in a world that feels more that way than we used to. Because if anything, it does seem to me that we're moving toward a world with more media balkanization. And I mean, like, obviously you have, like, I'm not talking about big media conglomerates merging and like kind of from an antitrust perspective. I'm just talking about the fact that you have, you know, YouTube, you have studios taking chances on movies like Get Out, you know, you have, you know, writers being, you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates being put in charge of comic books, which then get flipped into movies. You have, you know, people like Roxane Gay plucked to work on comic books and all this kind of interesting crossover. And it's hard for me to see today's world, even if obviously there continue to be limits to opportunity, as more restrictive than what we've had historically.
Well, I don't know. I think it's, I don't know. As somebody who's like been online for a while, it feels like, I don't know. For me, like, the internet felt like kind of an escape from mass culture, or a place where I could sort of engage in one sphere of one very niche interest. And now it feels like a lot of that stuff has sort of, you know, come together. As far as like, I don't know, like I don't think it's a linear thing. I don't think like things have gotten worse, like completely. I mean, I think things are just different than they were before. And like, a lot of these networks were always, or at least in the recent history, very corporatized, and like what was able to be expressed or you know, talked about on them was always controlled by this money. But I guess I feel frustrated with like, I feel frustrated that it feels like conversations around media is very sort of consumer based. It's very it's not engaging with the sort of complexities and the bits and pieces of it that I think might actually add more of a add more of a perspective to it. Like, from the perspective of someone who's an artist, like, I want people to be able to talk critically, not just about cultural context and all that, but like what goes into making a piece of art, like what goes into pop music, what goes into that stuff, the sort of production aspect, because I think it's important, and that's a part of the conversation that people are missing. I feel like people are looking at it that you sort of have you can choose to look at whatever mass media from whatever angle you want to look at it from, and there will be a sort of a niche or a place that's built around that. But having a conversation that fully acknowledges how these things get into the public consciousness and maybe questions that to some respect, like isn't happening. I don't know. Have you heard the term poptimism before?
I haven't. Okay.
Well, it's sort of this idea that specifically it applies to music writing. And like music writing has traditionally been, it's traditionally like rock music writing, you know, it's very like white male commentary about popular music, which is mostly, you know, popular music from the 60s, 70s, or whatever. That's sort of when it came into ascendancy. And that sort of continued into the 90s, and and then it sort of continued into more indie publications like Pitchfork Media or something, which was, you know, originally covered more indie music from the 90s and early 2000s. And then there was a pushback against, you know, the stodgy kind of commentary, like what people refer to as rockism, which is like a lot of these guys who are very not open to talking about other genres of music, like kind of reaction against genres like dance music, like hip hop to some extent, pop music. And so I think there's been a different trend that happened in the last 10 years of people examining and talking about pop music critically, which is a good thing, but there's often a lack of like understanding of the limits of like what this music can actually achieve. Like people talking specifically about, you know, pop music as a carrier for activism, or like, you know, why X or Y pop song is like subversive. You know, like the classic example is like, I don't know, I see a lot of people, you know, it was like Beyonce, and also like Carly Rae Jepsen and Lana Del Rey I see come up a lot. And like, I think while it's interesting to examine pop music from the angle of, you know, what these things it may be communicating, we also kind of have trouble engaging with how much of a role kind of celebrity and how much of a role sort of us projecting our own sort of interpretations to it without actually looking at like how these things are made and presented to us, is part of that whole is part of that whole piece of media.
So to be specific, the concern is that we're talking about Lemonade as revolutionary, let's say, because it is so open about marital distress, unapologetic about her commitment to her relationship. It says interesting things about how Black feminism might be different than white feminism insofar as being a credible part of a relationship is something that is progressive in the Black community, where we aren't usually credited with having genuine relationships and love matches, because it adopts, you know, she literally put on Black Panther outfits for the Super Bowl, all these kinds of things that people discussed, but that you're saying that we should have also simultaneously been having a conversation about the fact that ultimately it's a pop record and it was released the way it was to just get the most, clicks and buys. And
it's released to a mass audience, like, and that is like, it's approved by studios and executives which have exploited women and Black women especially for a long time. And like, I think there are a lot of interesting, I really like Lemonade. I think it's also interesting musically. It's also really interesting musically in terms of like the different genres and all the stuff it takes on. But like, I don't know. I think there's just a part of the conversation that I feel like is missing there. I don't know. That's just my reaction. I'm not saying that.
I'm just trying to drill down on what that part looks like, because I guess my reaction is that I guess I assume that that we all are aware of the fact that obviously Beyonce is a big pop star, and obviously at the end of the day this is calculated to sell records, and I guess I don't feel like the wool is being pulled over my eyes, but I think that you must be onto something, because when I was having this conversation on Struggle Session this weekend, they similarly expressed their critique of Black Panther was that, people aren't seeing that this is a Disney film, and people don't get that, Disney is downplaying real revolution, and they're making it, they make it so that the bad guy who has all these revolutionary ideas ultimately has to be the bad guy, and that when the good guy adopts some of the good revolutionary ideas, he executes them in this really tepid kind of neoliberal way, right? And my reaction wasn't that criticism was so much like wrong, but that we all know it's Disney, and this is still something that's revolutionary for a Disney film, for the context, which I think that I assume we all understand. And I don't have any expectation that Disney's going to put out something that's genuinely encouraging people to like rebel against their governments, right?
I mean, I don't know, though. I mean, I don't think that necessarily everyone has that context or really understands that to that same degree. I mean, like, I don't know. I just see, like, from the perspective of, like, I see a lot of people that I know who are white who consider themselves allies in one way or another, sharing media like Lemonade, for example, and sort of presenting it in a way of like, sort of using it as almost like a way of communicating that you're down with, you know, whatever, you know, you're down with Black Lives Matter, you're down with, you know, whatever struggle. And it just seems like kind of a low bar for the way that like it's sort of been pushed as like, some of these media have been pushed as like, you know, kind of like specifically towards white audiences, that like if you're an ally, you need to sort of consume and understand this piece of media. And I feel like for a lot of people that I know who do that, like they lack an understanding about the nuances, the more sort of culturally complex parts of the experience. And like there is an attempt to engage with that, but I feel like oftentimes people just pick whatever celebrity they like the most in terms of what they're saying, and then go with that, and then think that that speaks for an entire, you know, an entirety of an experience of one marginalized group or another. And like being part of the trans community, I've seen this. I've seen people, and I mean, this informs a lot of my perspective, because I've seen people who talk about transphobia and transness, and who push a particular narrative, this idea that there is a particular one kind of particular trans culture or trans narrative to a mostly cis audience. And I don't necessarily agree with a lot of those people oftentimes, or I feel like it's often more complex. But when it reaches that point, like something is lost in translation. And I'm not saying that, like, I mean, obviously that's going to be the case no matter what, but I just feel frustrated that some of these more complex conversations aren't necessarily happening. And I do think, like, from what I'm seeing with Black Panther, from what I've seen, it seems like it's a bit more complex of a piece of media, and there's a lot of different stuff that is represented in the different archetypes in it. But like, I don't know. I feel like it's dangerous. It's a dangerous thing for a lot of people, because I do think they read media consumption as like the end all be all, or at least like the most important way to show solidarity and understanding of, you know, the issues that affect a particular marginalized group. And that just strikes me as odd and uncomfortable.
I think that's a very fair criticism, and I have a lot of empathy for your perspective that, you know, it's frustrating to feel like people are out there preaching one particular way to be trans or, you know, Black or whatever it is. I think that impulse is largely what drove me to start writing, right? Because people were saying that to have a certain kind of leftist politics, you had to be white and male, right? So I have a lot of empathy for that, but I think that a conversation that says, or a critical perspective that says, let's talk about the ways in which kind of like performative wokeness or adopting celebrity symbols, you know, is an insufficient path to allyship. It's ultimately superficial, and that we can't read more into this than it is, which I think is a valid criticism of both Beyonce and Black Panther, for instance. I think that's a fine conversation to have, but I don't know that can't just happen alongside of a genuine appreciation and enjoyment of pop culture products. And maybe this is just my own naivete as someone who feels very aware of the limitations of something like Black Panther and Lemonade, and also who very much enjoys them as pop. But it does seem to me that they are pop, and they are explicitly being sold as pop. And this isn't an instance of something like an indie film or, you know, a New York Times bestseller or something that's taken to mean something more substantive than it actually is. This isn't, you know, a politician whose message is being credited more than is deserved, right? These are ultimately Marvel movies and top 40 records that we're talking about. And it's hard for me to believe. I mean, I know that there, of course, are some people who, you know, took Lemonade or their appreciation of Lemonade as a stand-in for how like down they were for Black people, but I don't know what that, like, what's the alternative to that? You know, just to have Beyonce put a disclaimer on the front of every one of her albums that says, "Buying this doesn't make you woke."
No, I mean, I don't think, like, as far as like the album itself, like I don't have that many, like I don't have criticisms of Beyonce specifically for putting that album out. Like I just think it's important to have, like, I'm okay. One example of something that I'm watching right now that I enjoy a lot, but I also feel like has a lot of serious problems is the show Parks and Recreation. Like, and I find that show very enjoyable as like a piece of, you know, it's like a light sort of character-driven comedy. But it's not like I'm from the Midwest, and I don't particularly find it representative of the Midwest, like in terms of local politics. Like it feels like a show that was filmed in California, which it was as far as I know.
I'm sure.
I don't know. But like I had that same criticism of what was that? The first Heathers movie, not the new one that came out, because it's supposed to be based in a town in Ohio, but it seems like Orange County.
Are you from Ohio?
Yeah.
Oh, my mom's family is from Ohio.
What part of Ohio?
Cleveland.
Oh, Cleveland, yeah. Yeah, I'm like probably about an hour and a half south of Cleveland. I went to school near Cleveland. I went to school at Oberlin College.
Oh, cool beans. Everybody at Oberlin's woke.
Yeah, God, I have some serious issues with Oberlin. Actually, Lena Dunham graduated a year ahead of me because I was a film major.
Did you know her, or did you know of her?
I knew of her, yeah. I'd seen her films, and I definitely was. I had mixed opinions.
I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think people should enjoy this stuff. Like, I don't want to like go back because there's this trend in like popular media in the 70s in particular, like Hollywood, like the new Hollywood movies in the 70s, where there are just these depressing, like dank movies about like government conspiracy and like you know, like hard-edged political thrillers. And, you know, like really kind of gritty, realistic media. And I don't necessarily even like a lot of that stuff, or like, I don't think that that's the answer for, you know, I don't think that like pop in itself is inherently bad or that people should not enjoy it. I just think, well, like with something like Parks and Recreation, like it's like, I understand that it is kind of very indicative of this like Obama and Hillary era sort of, liberalism, and like that's echoed in the way that it's written and stuff, and the way, you know, that it's presented. And like I think I guess like I have the impulse to be very critical of things that I like a lot, and I don't want people to feel like you can't enjoy something, but I think it is important to like kind of be understanding of maybe works that do attempt to engage on a more nuanced level with these things, and understand that and sort of use that as part of the way that we critically look at pieces of media. And like, I just wonder if, you know, a lot of the mass audience that's watching some of these like mass cultural products is really doing that, or at least is really like trying to, I don't know. I don't think Get Out and Black Panther are good examples, because I do think that they're actually pretty nuanced pieces of media. Well, I don't know about Black Panther, but like from what I can see, they seem to be fairly nuanced pieces of media in comparison to like other mass cultural products. But I think it's like, I think it's really important to examine it critically, and I just don't know if like there's an incentive to necessarily do that sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I respect the concern, and I also will admit to having, the biases of my own perspective in the internet that I curate for myself and the kind of critical pieces that I see. But I guess I don't see, because of the world that I've curated, I see a lot of criticism along those lines. Like I said, like I just spent, like an hour and a half debating with these guys about whether or not, Black Panther, is being overly credited for being something it's not, when it's ultimately a Disney film, right? Like, so these two who are in my circle, very prominent leftist commentators, are like immediately on the ball. Like that's their take from Black Panther. Like that's immediately what they go to. So it's not that I disagree with you. It's just that I guess from my perspective, the need is being met more than the need seems to be being met from your perspective. And I also appreciate that, like, I am very much in a silo and in a bubble of sorts. And so yeah, I want to really credit your perspective.
I think left Twitter is also is definitely a bubble. Because there are a lot of discussions that I see happening in left Twitter that haven't really permeated outside of it, or at least I haven't like been able to have those conversations with people who don't regularly engage with that stuff. And I don't know, for some things it's like if it's about a beef or something like that, then who cares? But if it's about something more crucial and important, then I don't know, it can be frustrating. Anyway, we can move on from that particular conversation. I guess, like, again, like I'm coming from the perspective of like wanting to support like smaller creators who are maybe taking more chances doing something, because I know how difficult it is to get. I mean, it's really difficult, especially if you don't live in like, a main cultural center. Like you live in New York, I live in LA, but like people who live, outside of like the main cultural sort of places where you don't have these sort of built-in resource networks to connect to people who are doing creative stuff, who are interested in that. Like it can be very hard to find that, and it's not necessarily very easy or intuitive. So I think part of it is like, I just have a lot of empathy for people who are working sort of outside the system or working in a place where they're doing something that's a little bit more nuanced or challenging, that isn't necessarily echoed by like the main consensus or whatever.
Yeah, I second that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's been interesting actually to see like the ascendancy of left Twitter, because I feel like I was trying to engage with some of that stuff. Like it's funny to me that like I read Jacobin as kind of like a relief from other websites. Like it felt like this breath of fresh air when I discovered it, and now it's like this kind of hard ideological. It feels very calculated in a way, and like I've written an article for them and everything, but like because of the ascendancy of Bernie and a lot of that stuff, like a lot of this left media has grown exponentially. And while I think it's like been really good that there's a lot of this stuff has sort of come out of the ether, like I also think it's weird because it feels like I don't know, I almost feel like I have to engage with things in the way that left Twitter engaged. Like there's this kind of like groupthink or whatever to it, like, and it's not conscious, like it's totally unconscious. But yeah, I don't know.
I think I've observed that. I mean, I got a pile-on from a crew that I really thought were my allies and very much aligned politically a couple of weeks ago for saying something that I thought was pretty innocuous. I mean, it's the same kind of identity politics line I've been saying all along about how there's a difference between a form of identity politics which protects the particular interests of people from various interest groups, kind of a marginalized identity groups, and a kind of identity politics that puts the identity of a candidate over whether or not that candidate is particularly attendant to the needs of the group they purport to represent, right? And I forget now what triggered it, but a couple of other like Black leftist allies from Twitter seemed to take issue with me at a certain point and kind of pile on and start subtweeting me. And it was a whole messy mess. So I do think that there are lines that get drawn, and there's a lot of like dogma even among the left where we perceive ourselves to, I think, be more nuanced and more critical thinkers. And that's troubling. And I do try to kind of write in a way that ignores those rules as much as possible, even if I spend paragraphs and paragraphs caveating, because I don't, I am still, I don't want to incur the wrath.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's, I think the more time that you spend within these online bubbles, the more that the more sort of talking points or ideology that you sort of unconsciously echo, just because that's like what you're seeing all the time. I don't know. I feel like I've felt myself pick that up a lot because I'm like on Twitter way too much.
Yeah, I think I started to try to like retweet less. Like there's a lot of stuff like I agree with. Like the more people I follow that are more like-minded, it's like I could be retweeting every single thing that I see. And I decided that that's not really helpful because we're all following the same people and it just becomes redundant. And to try to address other leftists who I think have had a lapse and maybe aren't quite as precise in their language as they might be able to be, or to try to identify issues that I think have been insufficiently plumbed, like in our not the last, maybe actually the last episode we put out, I forget now, but we did an episode on immigration in which I tried to ask a difficult question that I knew was going to make people upset, which is to say, the way that liberals talk about immigration now seems to assume that there's basically open borders. And maybe I'm for open borders, but that's not the argument that Democrats are making right now.
Yeah.
So what we're making is this kind of like inconsistent argument where we're saying, nobody said anything wrong, right? Immigrants have not done anything wrong, which I understand is a rhetorical point, especially obviously with respect to DACA recipients. But also we're not just going ahead and advocating for a borderless society. And if there is a border, then obviously you have to acknowledge on some level that crossing it, quote unquote illegally is quote unquote illegal, right? And as much as we want to kind of linguistically erase the idea of an illegal person, we still have to reckon with the reality of a transgression because that's what the Republicans are focused on. So are we going to either advocate for open borders, in which case, how can we do so in a way that's not like politically disastrous? And if not, how are we going to define what a progressive immigration policy looks like that does not allow every person in need to come and take refuge in our country?
Yeah.
And that's hard. That's like a hard conversation to have because it makes without caveating, that's not that you're trying to oppose immigration or oppose a more expansive immigration, but to say, I want to protect our argument. I want to make sure that we're making the best argument that can't be manipulated by the right, by really clarifying what it is we're actually saying, because our kind of wishy-washiness is being exploited by the right.
Yeah, and these because of like left media and like the left just growing in general, it's really important to have those conversations because like I feel like there's been a lack of addressing some of the more challenging questions because of the feeling of like, well, we just don't even have like a conversation on the left even happening. Like we don't even have a vision. So let's just try to get something out there. But like, it's really important to actually have these conversations. And I know that like, there's a similar thing with like, when you talk about like prisons and prison reform, like
right.
how are we going to treat incarcerated people? Like how, what is a vision of that going to look like, or the police, like, and it feels like there are a lot of disagreements about that within the left.
Right.
But those are some of the more complex and honestly interesting conversations, because it's something that there isn't like an obvious answer to, and it's more about like trying to formulate like a position and what actually might work, because with taking into account like whatever your moral framework is or whatever you feel like will actually be effective. And it is really crucial to have those conversations.
Yeah. Where does Me Too butt up against our feelings about criminal justice reform? That's what we handle in the first episode of this season. Like, what do we do with our desire to punish people who have done wrong and who historically have never been punished? How does that butt up against our desire to to increasingly decriminalize certain kinds of behaviors? And should we be looking to alternative ways to address at least some of these, less than criminal acts, or not, or is the cultural value of kind of encouraging, a shift toward greater accountability more important? Like, that's a question that needs to be resolved, because that lack of resolution is part of what's driving all these men to wring their hands about due process and want to throw the whole movement out in its entirety.
Yeah, well, and that's something I thought a lot about, because like I have been sexually assaulted, like, and like it was by a relative too, so it's somebody who I don't talk to anymore, but like I've thought a lot about like, I really hate this person, like I don't talk to them anymore, like, and on a personal emotional level I want them to rot in hell, but like in terms of like trying to imagine like what would happen if this person went to prison. Like a lot of people who like, especially like child molesters and things like that, they get like murdered in prison, or like they get attacked, and like, like, while I don't like want to defend them in any way in terms of like, especially being a victim of that, like, I feel like you can't just throw people out. Like you have to have a way to engage and feel like we have to believe that like some sort of like rehabilitation or something is possible, while still removing, the risks of this person, being out in the open and abusing people without punishment.
I think that's really well put. I feel the same way. And I think that it's very, very rare that you hear that sentiment, articulated, and for good reason. Like it's a very sensitive subject, and I think we're all rightly wary of being perceived as more attendant to the needs of abusers than the abused, right? But at the same time, my part of why I focus on strategy is because I think that focusing on morals sometimes is a losing proposition. So I can say, morally, of course, the victims of sexual abuse are unequivocally in the right. Morally, it's perfectly justified to want to err, on the side of the victim in every case over the victimizer, and morally, it's like it's a moot point. But in terms of kind of like the political argument and wanting Me Too to prosper, an argument that says let's be completely unconcerned with what happens to these bad actors, and let's kind of undermine our leftist principles and say we don't believe in rehabilitation in these in the realm of sexual crimes, even though we do in the realm of like other kinds of violent crimes like murder and physical assault. There's that's going to ultimately come back and bite us in the ass, because we get in our rhetorical trenches, right? We trod the same rhetorical arguments over and over and over again. Leftist Twitter like coalesces around certain kind of rhetorical pivots, and then we find ourselves not able to make a pivot when it becomes obvious that the terrain has changed. I'm super worried about a world in which the oppressor is no longer white, but we've decided that the way that we're going to characterize evil is by conflating capitalism with whiteness, and exploitation with whiteness, and colonization with whiteness. Because there's going to come a day when the colonizer is brown or Asian or black. And we're going to have Sorry, go
and
ahead.
that has happened in other countries.
Right, it's happening right now. It's happening right now, and I'm really wary. You know, I write these articles. Like I wrote a piece for Rolling Stone that cautioned against associating Trump with being pro-white, because of course Trump is racist, but what he's doing is not actually accruing to the benefit of white people. And by talking about him in those terms, you're basically saying, hey, white people, this is the guy for you, which is the opposite of what we should be telling white people, right? Especially, you know, low-income white people to whom he does not, you know, to whom he does not benefit in any way. So like that's where I'm coming from. It's trying to think like 20, 50 years out and big picture, and trying to coalesce a kind of argument that can be actually applied to all of these different instances. And that's part of why kind of the economic justice argument appeals so strongly to me, because it actually names the true enemy. The true enemy is not whiteness per se. Whiteness has been a tool of the enemy in this country and should rightly be viewed with skepticism. But if we focus exclusively on whiteness without looking at what whiteness has served, which is this, you know, the oligarchy, which is kind of, you know, economic exploitation, then we're going to wake up one day and to a perfectly diversified world in which people are still very, very, very much suffering, and we're going to have to reinvent entirely new language to, you know, address our concerns.
Totally, absolutely. Yeah, all that stuff you said was good. I think, I think like there is a kind of, I guess maybe it's a cultural thing, maybe it's an American cultural thing. I almost feel like it might be a puritanical thing of like, we need, like our attitude towards cultural and cultural commentary is very like one-to-one. Like we need something to sort of echo our perspectives or validate us in some way. And I think that's because like the place that culture has, that like mass culture has, and like, and news media is really part of mass culture. We need something that feels like it validates us, because there's so much in the world that feels so invalidating just on a human level. And then like on an extra level, you know, if you're any kind of marginalized, or you've had to struggle in really any way. And so instead of like being able to sort of have a community and build this stuff and have difficult conversations, we haven't even been able to do that. Like we're in places where like really like what people just want is to feel emotionally validated.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's even a lack of that. And so like a lot of people are sort of looking for and fighting for emotional validation in these issues. And I wish like at some level why can't we just say like, these are all serious problems, you know, like, and like your pain is valid, you know, it's not valid. And I think that's the thing that I struggle with. Like, when we fight about these things, like I wonder how much of it is just people wanting to feel validated in some way, but just not being able to, or not feeling like they're able to, and not having any ability to like move beyond that part of the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I have not yet resolved how I want to handle this, and this is part of why I haven't written this article yet about kind of changing our language, because I understand it more than anybody, or at least as much as anybody, what cathartic value there is in saying, oh, white tears, right? Like I understand more than anybody the cathartic value of saying, oh, he's just white-splaining, he's mansplaining, like shut up, listen. Like that was me 100%. I was the queen of that like 2 years ago, you know, like, so I'm not coming from a place of judgment. I'm like coming from a place of sincere understanding. But whereas like my friends would laugh at me because I once missed a bus because I sat in Cambridge like arguing with some of my friends from college about how like these two white guys, like you just weren't getting it and you don't get to tone police and da 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 da. And I don't think I was wrong morally, right? Mm-hmm. But I've come to feel differently now than I did then. And part of it is living in Trump's America, where it's very clear that we have not won the culture wars that we thought that we had won. And we do not have the authority just to be basically lecturing people and hoping that they stay on our side. And I'm concerned about a choice of language that would make people feel marginalized in a way that's unnecessary. So what I fully encourage people in their safe spaces, when you're with your, fellow women and with your fellow people of color or whatever group that you belong to like kiki about the majority group and about how trash they are. Like I really am hesitant when I see, especially like in mainstream publications and on Twitter, which, it feels private, but it's very public, using the kind of language that basically is pointed to by people on the alt-right as a justification for why, white men are really being persecuted and why they need to have white pride and all of this stuff. And it's a slippery slope, right? Because I don't want to be saying it's the left's fault that the right has decided to be Nazis, right? That's never what I want to be saying.
Well, and that's the debate that a lot of people have had over that Angela Nagel book.
Right.
Where she, suggested that the sort of Tumblr leftism, Tumblr identity-centric debate led to the reactionary, spurred on the reactionary community, which I'm like, I feel kind of like both ways about, I guess.
Yeah, like I think that she hits on, now in all fairness, I participated in a documentary, her latest documentary about this phenomenon, but like I think that there is true, like, no one is ever responsible, as I say in the piece I wrote for Rolling Stone recently, like the Trump racism piece, like no one is responsible for anybody else's racism, and that's just a fact. But you can't help but ignore that there is a pervasive narrative that there's been slippage from there is a such thing as white privilege to all white people are privileged above all people of color. And people don't say that explicitly, but that's tacit in the way that a lot of people talk about whiteness. And that's partly because class is not included in intersectionality.
Yeah.
So you have these people, if intersectionality were executed the way that the originators of the term intended it to be, then no discussion of privilege would actually be alienating to anyone, right? Because class would have an equal standing among all these other ways that people can be marginalized, and low-income whites and poor whites would be included. And I actually think in a world that was like perfectly inclusive, there would be some acknowledgement of the way in which masculinity and patriarchy also negatively affects a lot of these men in a different way than it affects women, right? Like a lot of these men are complaining about a culture which makes them feel inadequate because they aren't, super masculine macho guys who are slaying bitches or whatever, whatever pop culture tells them they're supposed to be. And, it's again one of these situations where I don't want to be playing the biggest violin for them when there's people who are more victimized. But the fact that there are people who are more victimized and more worthy of my tears doesn't mean that I should be forced to ignore genuine complaints coming from that cohort. And I feel like ignoring it, that there is any genuine concern coming from those people, is part of why it's been so easy for them to kind of like draw up ranks and see us as the enemy.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I was also for a period like I think I was always like came from the perspective of class, like particularly actually going to Oberlin kind of opened my eyes about class because, I was from Ohio and like my family is not like lower class, but we were not upper class certainly. And like that was the first time that I was around people who, whose family were, like parents were celebrities or were like CEOs or, things like that, and who had all like came from a very specific group of like private schools in New York and like just had a completely different kind of background, just fundamentally different from what I had growing up in a relatively conservative area in Ohio. Like, so I think class was always like something that I was thinking about, but like I definitely got sucked into the very identity centric discourse, and like after a while, like in like the trans community specifically, because I just had so many feelings about it to work through, and I had just never been around other trans people, and just like that feeling of feeling actually okay about who you are, and like that there's nothing wrong with that was like so good. But like what happened is I ended up seeing like a lot of people in the community abusing each other in so many different ways, like, like saying like, or why are you friends with this white cis guy or whatever? And it's like, well, I should be allowed to be friends with whoever I want to, like,
yeah.
Or, you know, things like that. And like one of the big sayings that caught on, like one of the phrases that caught on the trans community is die cis scum, which, you know, like, yeah, it's cathartic, but at the same time, like, I didn't feel comfortable saying that because I'm like, I mean, I had a few, like, and maybe, you know, the vast majority of white male friends that I had were not like completely understanding or supportive, but I had a few who were, and I didn't want them to feel totally alienated because I understood that they were at heart like decent people and that we just have different backgrounds and different like contexts that we come from.
Right.
And, you know, certain people, you know, some people are fundamentally still interested in like learning and growing and stuff. And if we didn't believe that people, even if they came from like a lot of privilege, weren't capable of understanding and growing, then we would live in an incredibly depressing world where no one ever grows and no one ever changes.
Right.
And no one ever like changes their mind when being presented with evidence. And, you know, and that's just a depressing vision of reality to have that I did not want to prescribe to.
Yeah, and incredibly conservative, right? It's a conservative vision of humanity that says that people can't change and that people are kind of essentialized in that way. I mean, that's supposed to be the opposite of who we are as liberals. And, you know, I identify as a humanist, you know, and look, I don't, it's hard though, because you don't want to slip into like, not all men, right? Like, but the very notion that like, you know, I was talking to someone recently about how this notion that like, to say all lives matter is understood as a way to undermine the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And that is the way it has been wielded. But there's a version of history in which Black Lives Matter, I mean, it started very organically as a hashtag, so I don't know how much thought was actually put into it, but that instead of Black Lives Matter, the hashtag was All Lives Matter. And it similarly was pointing out the discrepancy between how Black and white lives treated, because all lives obviously aren't being treated equally, right? The same message, but it's less vulnerable to the kind of attack that Black Lives Matter is vulnerable to. And we were discussing, you know, like, is this, you know, are we just all lives mattering ourselves? Like, are we just being strategic? You know, is there more power in saying Black Lives Matter than all lives matter? Like, these are questions that can be debated. But the idea, you know, like, it makes me feel kind of weird to be able to kind of like hold in my brain in one spot the knowledge that people use all lives matter inauthentically, and hold in my brain in another spot that, oh, there's a way in which all lives matter can be meant authentically in a way that doesn't undermine, but in fact serves the purposes of this movement. And similarly, I feel like, okay, like I find myself wanting to say, okay, obviously we're not talking about all cis white men are scum. You know, like, and I understand that that's tacit in what we say. Like, when we say things like that and white people are trash or white tears or whatever, like, we don't actually mean all white people. But I am also sensitive to the fact that people do hear it that way. Mm-hmm. And like, if I'm a political movement who wants to pursue certain political objectives, I can't be ignorant of the fact that some of the people that I want to reach and I want to be allies are, for better or worse, going to be turned off. And the line that, oh my God, you weren't a good ally anyway if you were going to be turned off or something like that sounds good. But like, in real life, I'm the one that's hurt by that. You know, you're the one that's hurt by that.
It's a little too easy to say that, I think.
Right.
I think it's a little too easy.
Yeah.
It's funny, like, I thought a lot about the term. Like, you know, the area that I grew up with was very white, and like I kind of knew that a lot of people that I grew up around were racist, and it was almost like weird though, because I feel like it was a sense of like moral superiority, and I think part of it had to do with the fact that, like, you know, I was like middle class as opposed to lower middle class, or, you know, whatever. And, you know, it didn't come up until I remember talking to a friend and I used the term white trash, and he's like, I don't use that term. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't like that term. Mm-hmm. And then I thought about it and I'm like, wait, yeah, that is actually not a good term to use.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
But I had never thought about it, like, and I've never actually sincerely used that term since then, but like that's just a reflection. And I think like from the perspective of like, like I would say like middle to upper middle class to upper class, more educated white people who grow up in more urban areas, like you have more education and understanding about the right sort of terminologies and the right kind of, and the context behind all of these things. But it becomes this like game where you're just kind of like looking down on people who have, some legitimate serious grievances, without actually addressing any issues, any of the central issues behind it, because you feel uncomfortable at some level, and you're displacing that uncomfortability onto somebody with less, money or resources than you. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of like really twisted side to it. And I see that like just over and over again, where like that's an aspect to the commentary, to any commentary around like popular activism, that is always hard to like disentangle, because it's always part of it.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good example. It's stunning how often, like I similarly had a close friend, a Black woman in college, who was the one who was like, never let anybody say white trash, right? And it was usually like my white friends who loved to say white. I had one who loved to call people trash bags. Like, and she was from a very, very white state. And I think, and a very, very conservative white state. And she felt like it was a kind of like distancing herself from where she was perceived to be from, and to show like, oh, I'm not like those other people. And I have empathy for that instinct. But like, ultimately, that's like obviously not okay. And, it's, again, it's like, you understand it's hard to have these conversations in a world in which there's all these other like horrible things going on to marginalized people. But the reason that I focused on this is not because I like have the biggest heart for white people, but it's because I think that this having these kind of inconsistent values is what enables people on the right to say, oh, they don't really care about people of color. They don't really care about any of these marginalized groups. All they care about is feeling superior, and they're just using this as a political tool. They don't really care about trans bathrooms. They just want to make us feel bad. You know what I mean? And when people are walking around saying things like trash bag, like it gives credit to those arguments.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a lot of media that does as well. Like I think a lot of, like, if you grow up in a more upper middle class place, like and like as a white person, like you don't necessarily have experience with people who live in trailer parks or whatever, so that it's just easy to say whatever you want to say about it, but without really actually understanding some of the context about that stuff. And I think it's like really, really important. I don't know, it's frustrating because I feel like, again, it goes back to people wanting to have the moral high ground, people wanting to, like, we're very much a culture that's about performativity, and we're also about like, surface ways of demonstrating your understanding of an issue on the surface, which inherently does not bode as well for people who are not as well educated, or who are not as well educated with that specific aspect of culture. And it doesn't necessarily mean like someone who says all the right things may be still incredibly racist, or at the very least like doing things that hurt Black people, or hurt women, or hurt trans people, or whatever, like a disproportionate amount more than somebody who's in a trailer park who doesn't really have that much effect. And I guess I also view that in terms of like these alt-right, the way these alt-right groups are like recruiting people. They're kind of using people who don't necessarily have much influence or agency or whatever, and using their sort of disillusionment and manipulate, and kind of people like, Jordan Peterson or like Mike Cernovich or those kind of people are sort of helping manipulate and mold these people to almost like carry out the dirty work. Like the people who are doing public shootings and like that kind of stuff are people who feel disempowered or whatever, and that's their way of exercising it. But the people who are having the most like sort of parasitic effect are people with more power and more resources and more, and like being able to, but because as a culture we view those people as having maybe more dignity or having more them being more well composed or whatever, we are unable to acknowledge the ways that like this stuff is coming from inside the building,
Yeah.
Because I don't know, at some level I feel like there's not a lot of difference in terms of lifestyle and other things between someone like Jordan Peterson or Mike Cernovich and some of these other media personalities. And, while their values might be different in some ways, like the way that they present themselves, their sort of lifestyles, the kind of people that they hang out with, the people, the ways that they sort of ingratiate themselves with power or whatever. And I mean, these people are more fringe, I guess, but like, that like we have to, I don't know, we have to be, I feel like there's a lot of there's a lot of evil there, but it's not obvious and it's not on the surface.
Yeah. And the part of I'm like ginning up to write something about what's his name, Jordan Peterson, because I think he's like a really prime example of how kind of leftist imprecision like gives space to people like him to seem credible and to seem right about things. I first was introduced to him in that debate he was having with the woman from BBC, in which frankly he comes off as the better one, right? Because she spent the whole time arguing things that he never said, and it made her seem like she was this leftist, like a liberal media person just out to get him, and that he was completely credible. And it's not that he's credible, but she, like a lot of liberals, fail to actually address the part of his argument that is wrong, and instead of argue as a part of his arguments, to just kind of feel icky because we haven't thought them through. So, He's a guy who, and I have to, refresh my memory, so apologies if I misstate, but my understanding is that he never said, for instance, that men and women shouldn't work together in the workplace. He's very careful not to say anything like that out, right? What he does say is that, of course, it's expected that there would be sexual harassment in the workplace because he's like an evolutionary biologist person, and he's like, because animals are animals and lobsters or whatever he says. And the implication of what he's saying is that, this is somehow natural and that it's a fool's errand to try to limit harassment. But up and until he actually says that, making those kinds of arguments just make it sound like we're the ones that are being irrational, and that we're the ones who won't acknowledge some like basic realities about like the interaction between the sexes, right? Like, yeah,
well, and this is a common tactic, sort of flipping rationality back on feminists or activists or marginalized people, and saying that no, actually we're rational and you're irrational.
Yeah but the thing is, like, we've got to not be irrational, because sometimes we are irrational. And I don't.
Yeah, they wouldn't make that argument unless it wasn't true at some point.
Right? Like Steven Pinker got into hot water like a month or so ago, because he was talking about gender and the sciences, and how he basically defended Larry Summers, saying that STEM. There are fewer women represented in STEM because women just choose other careers. Now, the issue isn't that. So he starts out by saying, people are so crazy that if you say that sometimes men and women, obviously this is like a very, narrow conception of these terms, but men and women choose different careers. Like liberals will tell you like that's an insane proposition, but we see in like very equal societies in Scandinavia that when there's pure very high freedom of opportunity, that women do self-select into these careers, and men do self-select, and therefore that proves that like STEM is the way it is because of nature and not because of like prejudice and bias. Well, I disagree with the latter part of that. I disagree that you can fully attribute the gender disparity in STEM field to choice, because we see all of these instances in which if you optimize people's true ability to make choices, you see different outcomes. And also because culture is such that from such an early age, women are indoctrinated with ideas about what they should and should not do, that it's impossible to say just because you've like fiddled with something down the line that you've truly made it a world in which women genuinely feel like all options are available to them. At the same time, you sound like a nincompoop if you don't acknowledge that there are some broad trends that do start to happen, but like the differences between cis men and women, like you see like from childhood, like, and obviously these aren't written across the board. Obviously the point is to be accepting of people who are divergent from those norms, and not to feel like a girl has to be a certain way or a boy has to be a certain way. But like I'm not going to sit here and deny that psychologists have observed gendered play in little kids, and that maybe it's only 7 times out of 10, but 7 times out of 10, a girl child's going to play with the doll and the boy child's going to play with the truck, and that is what it is. Like, I don't need to deny that empirical reality to also make an argument about how people should be treated in society. And I think that sometimes we're so worried about what it means if we make some of these kind of earlier admissions that we end up digging ourselves into a hole where we seem like irrational.
Well, yeah, I think like, I think it's important to when you're like in a debate with somebody like Jordan Peterson or Richard Spencer or somebody like that, you have to actually, and I mean, you've talked about this, I think, in Current Affairs, like you have to examine the effectiveness of what they're actually trying to do, the effectiveness of their argument, and not try and react to it in a moral way or be like, oh, do you really believe this? Or, kind of, but I feel like that's a thing that particularly people in media are not really equipped to argue against that perspective in that way. But I'm actually it's interesting because I've over the last few years discovered a handful of different sort of more left-wing YouTubers, because there's a lot of right-wing pundits on YouTube. And people who fuel the alt-right and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of it happened because of like gamer-related stuff, Gamergate and things like that, which is like, I was like fairly close to some of that stuff. So it's very weird to like see how much of that grew over time. I also think it was like very easy to dismiss it, but like there are a handful of YouTubers that I see who are leftists who are really good at taking some of these YouTubers who other people will dismiss as just being like total reactionary buffoons, which maybe they are, but like that doesn't, even if they're really popular and their arguments are effective, then it's still like important to like examine what's going on there. And like taking those arguments and breaking them apart and showing why they're not true or why they're not true, why they are or aren't true, and yeah, maybe laughing at them or mocking them, but in a way that like it's actually engaging with them and their ideas, which I think is actually really important, because these people are having, like, these YouTubers and these other pundits are having a huge impact over culture. And if you can't understand why, and you don't have a way to counter that by with science and with empirical data and with other stuff, then you're not going to have any way of sort of discrediting or bringing these people down or bringing their fans into something that is less reactionary.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Michael Brooks is someone who I think has a good approach to this, and who kind of is unafraid to meet these guys kind of where they are and to engage where useful with their arguments. Also, ContraPoints does a really good job.
Yeah, I had her on the podcast a couple episodes ago.
Oh,
we talked
check
about
that out. Yeah, she's great.
Yeah, because she's gotten a lot of trouble with like the trans community because she wanted to debate like some far right, alt right YouTuber.
Yeah, I saw exactly. That. I mean, it wasn't like I didn't track it that closely, but I saw that and I was a little confused by it. I think the idea of like platforming, no platforming, it's like platforming people is dangerous when you give a platform that is uncritical. Debating someone and being equipped to actually take on their arguments doesn't empower somebody, right? Like hosting someone to openly spew their beliefs is obviously not helping the cause.
Yeah, that distinction is super important.
But you don't have to like ban somebody from campus to put them in a situation where they're going to be actually minimized by coming to speak, because you have actually, if you believe, I feel like if you believe that your side is right, you should be able to confront these kind of arguments. And I think there's there's some damage to be done by simply banning and no platforming people, because the message they take away is, oh, our arguments are so powerful they couldn't confront us. And obviously on a case-by-case basis, it's different, and you're not always going to have someone ready to go at a drop of a hat who's, equipped to go up against Ben Shapiro, for instance, or, But, I also think that, to criticize someone for wanting to take on and destroy some pernicious, mythology from the right, I don't quite get how that's not in all of our best interest for her to take that on.
Well, yeah. Well, there's also the problem is like, as far as platforming, like these people already have a large platform. like YouTube gives them a large platform, and she wouldn't be debating them if they didn't already have a large platform and a large influence. And like, you watch YouTube, like you watch like one of her videos or anything, like these people's videos will come up in your recommendations,
right? Because
they have tons of views. Like it's hard to avoid them if you venture into certain parts of the internet. Right. Because of how popular they are. So like, it's important to be able to come up with something to address that. But yeah, we need people who are good at that, which is exactly what, ContraPoints is good at doing. And of course, like, I don't always, like, I'm not always down with everything that she says, but like, I think it's a really important space. And I hope more people take advantage of that. And I think that's like specifically, to sort of tie it back into what the whole theme of the show is, like, she's somebody who is taking upon herself to do it as part of a YouTube channel, which is something that people might frown upon or whatever. Like, you're not engaging with serious thinkers or ideas. You're not, being an academic and writing academic papers. But the fact that she's doing it in a way that is intended to be accessible to a larger audience, and it is engaging with some of these, personalities online as a venue for talking about these more complex issues, that come from like her academic background and stuff. I think that's like really important, and like that's something that we can do. Like that someone can take it upon themselves to do, like in this like new media landscape, and I think is really important. Of course, like she has said that when she started a channel, like a lot of these far right YouTubers, like they target people whoever like is sort of from the left or marginalized, or whoever has that is arguing from that perspective, especially when they start the channel. Like, a lot of these people target harassment against the people who are just starting their channels in order for them to just be like, okay, I don't want to deal with this, I'm going to delete my channel, in order to push them off the platform, basically. But because, she was able to see that that's a pattern and that's a thing that people do, and stay on it and sort of plant her feet down in it, she's been able to exist on that platform and do that. And I think like that kind of stuff is really important, and we have to like move beyond the emotional reaction and response to it and see like, okay, we gotta find something else here. Like we gotta dig for something deeper. Otherwise we're just gonna be reacting in terror to like this stuff existing, or, you know, dismissing it while it keeps ascending and being more popular. And, you know, if there's one thing that I definitely want to argue for, it's, you know, people who are more online and more on the internet are maybe more equipped to deal with.
Yes, that's exactly right. She is able to do it. She was equipped to debate this guy probably because she's been the first line of defense and has actually been engaging with people, have said, unlike these other people who Ben Shapiro stands up and says two sentences and they, you know, say something completely unrelated to what he's actually argued, right? Like you get you'll get someone who stand up and say, you know, something, you know, you think that all trans people should be rounded up and shot. Like they'll say something that's like goes too far, and he'll be like, I never said that, and then you'll lose the argument because you're not actually engaging with what the trash things he's actually said. He's saying these people have said plenty of trash things for us to be able to confront directly without having to be hyperbolic. Or, you know, like the Jordan Peterson example, you know, we don't have to, you know, there's enough that he said that's wrong without us having to argue that he said that men and women should never work together. If we argue that men and women, you know, he's never said that, and we're just setting ourselves to lose. And the only way we can know what he's actually said is to actually watch his videos and read what he's written and engage with what he said.
Absolutely. Well, I think unless there's anything else you want to talk about, that's probably a good place to end.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, no problem. It's great to have these discussions. Yeah, no, it's like, it's important to have more venues to have these conversations. And like, you know, my podcast isn't like super popular or whatever, but like, I'm sure whoever listens is going to appreciate it. So
no, it's my pleasure.
That's, and so you're the co-host of SWOTI podcast, which is swotipod.com, right?
Yes. Yes. Okay. It stands for Someone's Wrong on the Internet, but you can find us on iTunes and SoundCloud and Stitcher and all the things by searching SWOTI.
Cool. And your Briahna Joy on Twitter. I'll put your info in like the description for this podcast. Do you have any other things that you want to plug?
I don't think so. But if you follow me on Twitter, I will tell you when things come up. I'm going to be on the season finale of Nando Vila's show Happy Endings, which is what I was recording last weekend in LA. But I don't think that's out for a little bit of time. So just follow me to see what I'm writing and what I'm up to.
Cool. And your latest piece is called The Politics of Shame on Current Affairs.
Correct.
Well, thank you so much for coming. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you really for having me. I really enjoyed it.